welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Sharon Salzberg. Sharon is a world-renowned meditation teacher and bestselling author. Her emphasis is on vipassana, or insight meditation, and mettā, or loving-kindness meditation. In 1974, she co-founded the Insight Meditation Society with Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield, and she's been running retreats around the world for over 3 decades. Her books include Lovingkindness, A Heart as Wide as the World, Real Happiness, Real Love, and most recently, Real Change. Today we speak about mindfulness, loving-kindness, and the power of love to heal and make change in the world. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Sharon Salzberg. Sharon, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
So you're a teacher of mindfulness and loving-kindness meditation. How did you first come to discover these in your own life?
I went to India quite some years ago because the years go by, and suddenly January 7th, I celebrated my 50th anniversary of beginning meditation.
Wow.
So as my friends say, they said to me, "You did it before, it was cool." I said, yeah. I went a long time ago. I was going to the university in New York State, and I took an Asian philosophy course, which was really my first more in-depth introduction to these concepts. And in the course of the course, I heard that there were methods of practice known as meditation, and that if you actually put them into practice and didn't just think admiringly about them, that you could become a lot happier. And I was pretty unhappy. I had a very disrupted, chaotic, difficult childhood. And somehow, and I think about this moment so much, like, why wasn't I content just to stay at the university and think about these things now and then, or try to read a few more books about it? I just had a passionate desire to actually learn how to meditate. So this was 1970. I looked around the city in New York State that I was going to college in. I didn't see it anywhere. And so I created an independent study project and said I wanted to go to India and study meditation. And the university gave me their permission, so off I went. And that's how I actually began.
Wow. And so was it fairly early on in your time in India that you came across the Theravada tradition and the practices that you focus on, of vipassana and mettā?
It took a few. Well, of course, I also traveled overland, as we tended to do in those days, bus and train. It took a little bit of time in India to find just what I was looking for, because I had a great desire for something very pragmatic, very direct, and even though it was within the context of the Theravadan tradition, like Goenka, S.N. Goenka was my first teacher, and the first night of the retreat, the first retreat that I did, he said the Buddha did not teach Buddhism, the Buddha taught a way of life. And that was very much what I was looking for, so it did take me a while to find just that.
Yeah, actually, my first retreat was also a Goenka retreat, but unfortunately, I had to settle for having videos of him giving talks instead of the man himself.
Oh, yeah,
but even on the videos today, he makes the point that he was very much, raised a Hindu and saw these as a very pragmatic thing that could apply to anyone, right?
Yeah.
And then, so this was kind of vipassana, the kind of insight meditation. But in your career, you've become a real kind of leading voice on loving kindness or mettā meditation.
Yeah.
Did that come along in the same retreat?
It did in a certain way. Like Goenka ended the retreat, and maybe in your tapes as well. I'm not sure if he still did it later on in his life. He did a little bit of loving kindness meditation right toward the end. It was almost a ceremonial way of saying goodbye, and that really captivated me. I thought, what's that? And I really want to learn more about that. And I didn't actually have a teacher to guide me through a systematic experience of it, although I read about it and I tried to study it and understand it until 1985, when I went to Burma and did an intensive 3-month meditation retreat in Lovingkindness. And I came back in 1985. I'd already been teaching since 1974 and began teaching Lovingkindness, which was a little bit controversial, actually. I think within, there was a certain And there still is, I mean, actually, come to think of it, often one can think of that quality as kind of sentimental and lacking power and lacking conviction, about, say, social issues, or just being kind of goofy. And from the Buddhist perspective, some people would say that it is not an insight practice. It really deals with relative reality, like I, you, and yet I really felt, both from my own experience and then as I began teaching, that mindfulness, which is a word that has many definitions, if you define it as a quality of awareness where our perception of what's happening in the present moment is not distorted by bias, old fears, projection into the future, conventional judgments. That's not that easy, actually, especially if you have any kind of tendency toward self-denigration or being very hard on yourself, or not giving yourself permission to feel what you're actually feeling. And the loving kindness quality is in there. It has to be in there. Otherwise, we can't practice well, but it's often not named. It's not articulated. And these days, I see people often struggle in their efforts to describe the kind of inherent kindness that has to be there in mindfulness for it to actually be mindfulness. And they try to say, like, warm mindfulness or kindfulness or loving awareness, or, and I just say mindfulness because that's, it's been 50 years. And so now I'm set in my ways, but it's there. And so actually making the extra effort, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you're interested in it or challenged by it in a good way, to make the effort to actually cultivate that strength and bring it into the mindfulness practice, I think just helps everybody.
And how might someone practice loving kindness meditation if they've never heard of this before?
Unlike many mindfulness practices, which would perhaps have a start or have a foundation of resting our attention on an object like the feeling of the breath, something maybe in the body or the breath, and then expanding to incorporating or including the various things that come and go, thoughts and emotions and sensations and so on. Loving kindness practice, there are many ways, of course, of doing that as well, but the way I was taught and teach, we rest our attention on the silent repetition of certain phrases. And the phrases are meant to be a different way of paying attention. If we're thinking of ourselves, for example, instead of going through the list of our faults again, or all the mistakes we made just today again, we wish ourselves well. May I be safe. May I be happy. It's a sense of gift giving or offering. Because the phrases may be grammatically constructed in that way, people often say to me, who am I asking? I say, we're not asking anybody anything. It's like handing someone a birthday card, saying, may you have a happy birthday. May you have a great year. May you be happy. May I be happy. And instead of, the many, many people we might ignore or discount or look through, and often that's been people who play some role in our lives. Like, I think for 45 years, my colleagues and I have been saying, like the checkout person in the supermarket, the cashier, we usually objectify them, we ignore them. And now, these days, it's shocking to realize that. It's like, how do we think we get to eat if we're not growing our own food? That these are people, not objects. And so we, in effect, look at someone instead of through them. May you be happy. May you be safe. And so it's that feeling of generosity of the spirit, that gift giving, and we just apply it to various categories of relationship.
And you mentioned that people can kind of have this feeling of, well, who am I asking? or like that the love is some kind of interpersonal dynamic. But you've written about how maybe it's hard to pin down, but it's more like a verb. It's like an attitude or an orientation to the world, right? That you're not looking for a love, like romantic love or friendship. It's just this thing you're radiating.
Yeah, I wrote a book called Real Love, and when I was first submitting it to different publishers, an editor somewhere said, well, the love market is saturated. And what they meant was the romantic relationship market, how to find a relationship, how to keep a relationship, how to end a relationship. That's what they were referring to, but that's not what I mean. And I think, oddly enough, it's encapsulated best in this line that was in a movie that came out about 12 years ago or something. The movie is called Dan in Real Life. And one of the characters in that movie said, love is not a feeling, it's an ability. And I love that. Of course, it is a feeling as well, and the feeling we may long for. But if we think of it as a feeling, it's almost like a commodity. And very often, then we think it's in the hands of someone else to bestow upon us or take away from us. And if they take it away from us, we're bereft. We have nothing. So I'd often get the image of like a delivery person standing at my doorstep with that package of love, looking down at the address and saying, I think I'll go somewhere else. And I go, wait a minute, then I have nothing. But if it's an ability, it's inside me. And as a play on words, it's also a responsibility. It's mine to cultivate, to strengthen, to nurture. And certainly others bring it forth or inspire it or threaten it. But ultimately it is mine. And that's very much the sense of mettā or loving kindness. It's a capacity within. And it's powerful. It's not like gooey, because it actually does reflect a truth of interconnection, that our lives are intertwined. It doesn't mean you like somebody. It also doesn't mean you're going to spend time with them. Like, let's have dinner together, But within, there's not such a rigid, ossified sense of self and other and us and them. We realize, it's different than that. Reality is different than that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it's powerful, and the kind of love that we're talking about, and I absolutely agree. In my personal experience, there's this. You also write about love being the opposite of fear, and when it comes to like trauma and living in states of shutting off and closing down, orienting towards love really does feel like the axis one needs to be on in order to heal trauma. Yeah,
I think that's true. And it's also, I think one of the main characteristics of trauma is a sense of fragmentation. It's like something has been shattered, even if it's a slow shattering. We might associate trauma with what they call, I guess, in the field, shock trauma, like a car accident or gun violence, in our lives, something like that. But there's also the trauma of poverty, which is a kind of slow, chronic wearing away, at one sense of who we are and what we're capable of. And so no matter where it's rooted, I think there's a sense of fragmentation. And one of the characteristics of cultivating loving kindness as a kind of cohesion of our being. It's like, if that is my responsibility, if that is my capacity, then I also feel like, well, if I want love to be in a conversation, maybe I have to be the one to bring it forth. If I want love to be in an encounter, maybe I have to be the one to make sure it's in the room. And that gives me like a kind of North Star. It's a sense of meaning to guide my life by. And that is very important.
Right. And the idea of it being a North Star, I think, is important, because it's something that's going on inside yourself subjectively, right? But once you see the wisdom of living by it, it kind of forces change in the world. If you're living in that situation that's stressful and making you feel traumatized, if you want to be open and loving, well, you're going to very quickly see where it's safe to do that and where it's not. And you actually have to then make change in your life, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and I don't think we ever want to lose discernment. Sometimes people get confused about that, and they think it's part of the feeling like you're going to end up just this sort of puddle of, goofy emotionality, without clarity and without strength, and it's just not true. We always want discernment, and that's why I try to make a point of saying it doesn't mean you're going to spend any time with this person.
Right.
The cultivation of loving kindness doesn't necessarily mean, all's forgiven and forgotten. Let's just hang out. It's not like that.
Yeah.
But you can be free. You can be so much more free, perhaps, than you feel.
I feel like this, we're talking about closing off versus opening up, and we also touched on kind of cynicism around love. I think a lot of people in the culture at large, there is this, I think it's precisely because this attitude of love is so powerful that there's this kind of cultural meme of reflexively kind of shutting down conversation about it, because it calls a lot on us really to say we should all be opening up in this way, right? Because most of us have some wound or other that makes us kind of shut down and think that we'd rather not go down this road.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's definitely true, and it's a kind of conditioning. It's like certainly in my childhood, for example, there was a kind of undercurrent from certain people of what is a popular saying here, that it's a dog eat dog world. Like, don't help anybody else because they're not going to help you, and you're on your own, and you can't count on anybody, and it doesn't matter who you hurt on your way up. What's important is that you go up, and it's such a sad kind of conditioning. And I was really struck even before the pandemic how so many countries were talking about an epidemic of loneliness and the ways we are suffering from that. And even as I would read descriptions of the role of social relationship in clinical settings and the healing potential, I always thought, well, it can't be just numbers. It can't be like I only have 2 friends, I need 7. It's some inner sense of belonging, of being whole, of being part of a greater family of life, and that we can cultivate even if we don't have a very extroverted social calendar, and even now, as people are often isolated and so on.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of how a lot of this, I think a lot of our orientation on this topic comes about in early life through kind of attachment and attachment wounds. And I think the inner critic and self-criticism is something that, it makes sense that it evolved. It makes sense that it's a good coping mechanism when you're a kid to monitor yourself and think, well, I don't want to do anything wrong because I don't want to lose these important attachments. But then do you think that that's a major barrier to opening up to love in adult life, is the carryover of the inner critic?
I think that it could be seen as that, because I think there's a lot of kinds of conditioning like that have us not want to maybe reveal any vulnerabilities to anybody else, and therefore, how authentic is our communication? If we are in some place of not wanting to say, I was hoping we could get closer. That's a hard thing to say, You don't want to say that in every context, as you kind of referred to earlier. But if you want to know the truth of your experience, and if you want to express the truth of your experience, that's a lot closer than this is all your fault and you're a cold, unfeeling person and you never pay attention to anybody else, But how willing are we to even acknowledge to ourselves, oh, that was really born out of that resentment of somebody else's action or whatever, that was born out of my frustration of wanting and longing for something deeper that wasn't coming. So what helps us be honest about our vulnerability? What helps us forgive ourselves when we've made a mistake, which is many times a day usually? That was almost like lesson 101 in meditation. Like, you have an object of awareness. Let's say it's the feeling of the breath, or phrases of loving kindness. You rest your attention on that object. And when your attention wanders, you bring it back. And, I first heard that in my first retreat, as you did. And I thought, that's so stupid. Like, I came all the way to India to learn how to meditate. Where's the magical, esoteric, fantastic technique that's going to change my whole life? And then I thought, well, how hard can this be? Like, what'll it be? Like 800 breaths, 900 breaths before my mind wanders? And to my astonishment, it was like one breath. And I'd be gone. And I'd be way gone. And it took a long time for me to understand that the critical moment was actually the one that came next after having been lost. Being able to let go, being able to start over. And so we sometimes say that meditation is, first of all, it's a practice of resilience, because we're always starting over. And it's about renewal. It's about the return more than anything. And that, as dismissive as I was when I first heard it, I think is actually the most valuable thing I've ever learned in meditation, because every day we have to do that. We make a mistake and we have to start over, or we've fallen down and we have to pick ourselves up or let someone else help us up. We start over. Or we need to do a course correction. We're set on a certain aspiration or action, and new information comes in and it's like, whoa, every day, many times a day. And that is really not helped if you have it's not even a strong inner critic, but if you have the voice of an inner critic that you utterly believe and that dominates, because then it's not easy to start over. You have to spend 4 hours, blaming yourself first. And so it's tiring.
You've also written about this connection between mindfulness and kind of, you mentioned just believing these stories of the inner critic, and kind of with meditation, I guess you can go from just believing it to be true to seeing them as stories, seeing them as narratives. And that seems to be a very powerful way to kind of, I guess, to interrogate the barriers that we put up, the coping mechanisms that block us from being kind of open to love, both for ourselves and just generally.
I think it is, it's maybe one of the more subtle things we ever do in meditation practice, but it's so critical and it's so freeing to just see the assumptions that are guiding us as assumptions. And that doesn't mean they're all incorrect. Some of them might be quite true, but they're not all true. And to just have some space to at least question. And sometimes I tell the story about how when I first began teaching meditation, which was 1974, when I came back from India, the format which we borrowed from Goenka of how we teach intensive retreats, which is how we started, is, you practice, or there are Q&A sessions or something happens during the day. And there's one formal lecture at night. There's one discourse at night. For 45 minutes or an hour. And I was teaching with Joseph Goldstein, my colleague. We were invited to teach a 1-month retreat. That was the first retreat we taught in the States. And I was terrified of public speaking, terrified. And I couldn't give a single one of those talks. So Joseph had to speak for 30 nights. And people were coming up and yelling at him, like, why won't you let her speak? Why won't you let her have a voice? And he said, I would love a night off. Talk to her. But I couldn't do it. I was absolutely petrified. And the story I was telling myself was that I was going to be in the middle of a talk and my mind would go blank and I would just sit there and that people would judge me. And it was only later, and this was long before I went to Burma and formally did loving kindness practice, that I thought, there is that one kind of practice, like maybe if I only talked about loving kindness and my mind went blank, I could just launch into the guided meditation. Maybe nobody would know. And that's how I could begin to give talks. And it was after that I realized, they're all kind of loving kindness talks in that we're gathered here together for a sense of connection. Nobody's sitting here thinking I'm like the ultimate expert in this field and that, they want to imbibe my expertise. It's like, they're all about loving kindness, and that's when I could give talks. And, the story I had been telling myself earlier about needing to be perfect and never making a mistake, never even pausing, because it would be so embarrassing or whatever it was. It was just a story. And to be able to see it in the moment as that is the way to not be bound to it.
I think there's also the aspect of resolving the inner critic through responding to it kind of lovingly, I guess. This is also something you've written about, right? That if you're critical of the inner critic, then you're just going to kind of get caught up in a loop. But it can be a challenge, I guess. But if you just kind of see where that's coming from and allow it to be, that can be the way to move through it.
Yeah. I mean, that is really a critical understanding, I think, about mindfulness in general. And I think the inner critic is a wonderful place it's a wonderful example of just that. So one of the things we suggest is that if you have a persistent, very critical voice within, and it's not the kind that's giving you useful information, it's just bringing you down, give it a name, give it a wardrobe, give it a persona. Because as you said, it's all about how you're going to relate to it. So what's our temptation? One extreme, which we've talked about, is just buying into it. Like, you're right. You're always right. I'm worth nothing. The other extreme, though, is hating it or being ashamed of it or freaking out about it. Like, in my case, it would be, I've been meditating for 50 years. What are you still doing here, and trying to repress it or push it away. And that doesn't work either. And so we talk about mindfulness as a place in the middle where we're fully aware and connected to what's happening, but there's some spaciousness. So I sometimes go on to say, I've named my own inner critic Lucy, based on, with apologies to any Lucys who are listening, based on the character in the Peanuts comic strip. Because I moved into this house once, a friend was renting it for several of us to do a retreat in, and someone had left a cartoon from that, strip from that cartoon on the desk in the bedroom I was moving into. And in the first frame, Lucy is talking to Charlie Brown, and she says, Charlie Brown, what your problem is, the problem with you is that you're you. And then in the second frame, poor Charlie Brown says, well, what in the world can I do about that? And then Lucy says, I don't pretend to be able to give advice. I merely point out the problem. And somehow whenever I was walking by the desk, my eye would fall just on that line. Problem with you is that you're you. Because that Lucy voice had been so dominant in my earlier life. And but then I had all this mindfulness training, and something happened very soon after I saw the cartoon. Like, something great happened for me. And my first thought was, it's never going to happen again. And my response to that was, hi, Lucy. And chill out, Lucy. Just chill. Which is different than, you're right, Lucy. You're always right. And it's also different than, I cannot believe Lucy's still here. And I will never get rid of this voice. And this is so awful. And so that's the whole point. The same pattern may arise, but you have such an entirely different relationship to it that everything changes.
Right. I think that, I just realized that quote is really apt for the relationship between, I think, the kind of insight side of things, where you can get insight into selflessness and the kind of absolute nature of things, versus kind of the relative preoccupation with separation. Because from that mode, then the voice is saying, all I'm interested in is what's wrong with me, with this person over here, because that's what I can control and that's what I need to improve. And it's incredibly kind of, it's coming very much from this relative stance of separation and looking at what's the problem with being me. And then so I feel there's this amazing connection where once you have an experience of kind of this larger view, I guess, of kind of a stance where you're getting outside of your own mind, suddenly compassion seems to arise, self-compassion seems to arise very easily, because suddenly you're just another one of all the people. And for everyone else, you can see the causes that led to their errors. But for you,
Yeah,
when you're in
that's right.
the kind of relative separation, you don't
That's
give
right.
yourself that way of
Right.
seeing.
No, they're permanent. They're real. They're inflexible. All those faults. They're just like uh, we just reify them, tremendously.
And they're blamed to kind of some core essence rather than saying, oh, a series of things happened and I attribute it to the unfortunate events. In my case, no,
Yeah,
it's me. I am
that's
the
right.
problem here. um, and I feel like, so there's also I just mentioned how with awareness, compassion seems to arise kind of automatically. I think you wrote about mindful attention being kind of a doorway to compassion, or I'm using compassion as related to
Yeah,
this
yeah,
loving tone, right? And I think
yeah,
that's something that
yeah,
people who haven't experienced the kind of thing we're talking about, maybe they think love is just another emotion on the shelf, like that sits alongside fear and anxiety. But it does seem to be kind of underneath in some way, where if you let go, you kind of fall back into it.
I think that's really true, and some people shy away from, say, doing loving kindness practice, and you don't have to do loving kindness practice, certainly to deepen the quality, even through meditation, the quality of love and compassion. But if you are, some people have a particular squeamishness about doing loving kindness meditation because they think they're trying to force themselves to feel something they don't actually feel, and it seems hypocritical and quite inauthentic. But really, it's not about an emotional response, it's about how we're paying attention. It's like if you think about how much, I wonder if we could ever tabulate this, how much of our day we spend criticizing ourselves and how much we spend being kind to ourselves. Or, back to that supermarket clerk. What's that movement and what does it feel like when we are really objectifying them? As one friend of mine wrote about his experience in New York City going into this small grocery store in the neighborhood he was in. He realized there was a person who worked there that he saw very often and he actually never paid any attention to. Really, and he wrote, for all I noticed her, truly, she might as well have been a cash register with arms. And then he wrote about his experience of actually going in there and paying attention to her. But all those moments when we are discounting somebody, objectifying somebody, not recognizing this is a person or a creature, whatever it is, who wants to be happy, just like we want to be happy, and that movement toward just paying attention differently, which doesn't mean you're going to take them home with you or you're going to give them all your money or it's not a prescription for mandated action, but that sensibility really shifts. And this is kind of an odd story for that, but something you said really reminded me of this time I was in a car with a friend and we were caught in this terrible, awful traffic and we're complaining bitterly about it the entire time. And then my friend looked at me and said, well, we're the traffic too. And I thought, oh, that's right. It's like they're probably complaining about us. And somehow that sense of centrality, like it's my road, you're an interloper in my way, slowing me down. When that dropped out of the middle of my view of the universe, and we were all the traffic, which is actually true, then I felt a very different energy for dealing with the problem. Like, there's a problem. It doesn't mean that you're living in happy land, and everything is just fine. There's a problem, but it's not, the resolution is not helped by that sense of, it's really privilege. It's my road. You don't belong here. But we're all the traffic.
I feel like you've also written about on the link between meditation and this kind of state of this attitude of love, that people often kind of will be confused about, well, can you have the kind of non-attachment of meditation with this loving aspect? But you've written a lot about kind of, I guess, the nuances of why that's different to clinging, and that's not really part of the kind of love we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, especially these days with modern psychology and Western psychology, talking about attachment theory, and it's a very particular use of the word, I think, within the Buddhist psychology, which is not nurturing and bonding, and all of that. But I would sometimes try to deepen my own understanding of it by replacing it with the word control. Because that's what it really is. It's not the closeness or the caring so much, but it's that extra thing we do. I will love you as long as you love me in return, as long as you express that in a certain way, as long as the following 15 conditions are met. I will love myself as long as I never make a mistake. We know the fragility, the brittleness of that state and how breakable it is. So it's not really what we mean by loving kindness, which is more a state that can sustain us through ups and downs and changes and disappointments. And, it's not about getting what we want and clinging to that, which would be the attachment. Because otherwise we're so kind of fixated on the result. It's like if you offer loving kindness to a friend who's struggling, who's not having a good time, and they don't improve, then you think, wow, my meditation is like really bad. I couldn't like make it all better, which is how we usually approach pain. Like it's up to us to make it all better. And it's just so unrealistic, that when we say attachment, certainly within the Buddhist context, it's so specific a use of the word that I think it is especially confusing now, because we're not trying to paint the picture of this cold, aloof person who doesn't care about anybody, but we always want wisdom prevalent, and wisdom would tell us not in control. It's like if you think of loving kindness or compassion as a gift, it's like an energetic gift, but nonetheless it's a gift. You can't control how someone is going to take up the gift you just gave them. You give them a book and maybe they nod distantly and walk away, and it's like, whoa, I give terrible gifts. I'm like, why did I do that? But maybe not. Maybe they're just in a bad mood, or maybe they're in a good mood. They just did a cryptocurrency deal and they made like $70 billion or something like that. And you hand them the book and it's like, what? So we always want a kind of equanimity or balance, which means wisdom, with the offering of loving kindness or compassion.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the terminology could get confusing, but I think it was in Real Love you wrote about a kind of parallel between the kind of non-attachment, the Buddhist non-attachment, loving way of being, and a parallel to attachment theory and psychology, and saying that it kind of maps onto secure attachment as opposed to kind of anxious or avoidant attachment, and anxious being kind of like the clinging that you're trying to avoid. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting parallel. And then in your book, Real Change, it's a wonderful exploration of kind of how these things map onto actually making a change in the world. And I think it makes sense, right, that for a lot of us, we come to this through suffering, and we then, the compassion kind of, I guess, makes it logical that you want to go and help others and improve suffering in the world.
Yeah. And I think, again, it has something to do with resilience, because I think often of the stress dynamic, which is really a dynamic. There's like the pressure or the circumstance coming at us, and then there's the resource with which it's met. And we know that just from life, like you can be in a beautiful place and waterfalls, rainbows, surrounded by loving friends that you can't even acknowledge. You can't let them in because your inner state is so chaotic or in such turmoil or whatever. Or we might have a great deal of adversity happening, but we don't feel so alone. We feel like we're part of a community, or we're in love, or something is going on that is giving us this sense of inner resource. And so we meet the challenge in a different way. And it's very much along those lines that if we appreciate the possible role of meditation, for one thing, in building that sense of inner resource, then it's not just for ourselves alone, but it actually gives us the capacity to care about others and to try to work to make this a better world, or even to listen to others. I think we all have probably had the experience of feeling so exhausted and so depleted and so burnt out, and then somebody comes and they're telling us their rather sad story, and we're just thinking, please go away. Like, I cannot take this in. I don't have it in me to meet this moment. And we have to pay attention to that, because so often that commitment to building that sense of inner resource is seen as selfish or self-indulgent or self-preoccupied. But really, how are we going to go on and try to make a difference if we don't have that?
I think that's a really incredibly important point, that and you're right about there does, in certain kind of activist circles, there does seem to be a dynamic that plays out sometimes where there's a race to the bottom when it comes to self-care. It's kind of like you shouldn't be spending any time on yourself, which, maybe it does. If someone has their own suffering and they've not healed that, and they're kind of trying to work it out through helping others, I can see how if they can't give themselves self-love, they don't, you get into this race to the bottom. But I think it's the wisdom that you're offering of saying, of course, like it makes sense. You don't want to burn out. You need to resource yourself. And it's not spending 20 minutes in the morning doing loving kindness to yourself is not self-indulgent. It's not, especially if you're doing it with this compassionate intention to help others at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, and I think it's, it's realistic. Like, I have, translator friends, like Bob Thurman, who's a friend who just retired from teaching at Columbia University in New York. And practically his favorite word in terms of translating texts is realistic. And I used to listen to him and I think, that's not that exciting, as a prospect. I'm going to do all this, meditation to try to be more realistic. But the more I listened to him and the more I appreciated it, I saw that being realistic means being aligned with the truth of things, and we're only empowered by that, and we find healing in that, because if we're at some weird distorted angle to the truth of how things are, it's like banging your head against the wall. That doesn't help, it doesn't help yourself and it doesn't help anybody else. Like, to insist things won't change, or we can control what we can't control, or whatever it might be, it doesn't help.
I think also there's we've touched on this throughout. I guess it's the kind of distinction between empathy and compassion. But the kind of love we're talking about, right, is you're not, I can't remember precisely what you said, but you made a point about saying there's no mandate for having to actually do any action. We're not demanding that you have to go and give all of your possessions to every homeless person you see. And, I think there's a really powerful thing there, because the empathy seems to be to link to the burnout, right? To people getting emotionally kind of locked up into a situation in a way that's draining, as opposed to compassion, which is, it feels like it's going in one direction in a very positive way. It feels like it's being radiated out, and it's very healthy in that sense, and that you're wishing well for everyone, and then you can act in wise ways from that place, but you're not being kind of caught in a struggle, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, sometimes we say that empathy is a necessary but not sufficient condition for compassion to arise. So empathy in that sense would be that kind of resonance, like you see somebody seems to be struggling in some way, and it's not meant to be intrusive, like, I know exactly what you're feeling, because you probably don't. But there's some resonance, like, oh, that reminds me of the time when I couldn't get anyone to listen to how bad off I felt, or whatever. You likely are feeling quite alone, and we feel that, we have a kind of resonance with that. But what do we then do, So I do see it as a kind of sequential thing, like maybe you genuinely have that sense of empathy, and I also should say the world, as I see it, desperately needs that. We see how cold and cruel things can be without that, but it also doesn't inevitably lead to compassion. So, maybe we have that sense of empathy and we're frightened by kind of the enormity of the suffering we are sensing, and we just want to run away. Or we are exhausted. We feel depleted. We feel overcome. We just want to go to bed. It's like, I don't have it to deal with this. Or we feel blaming. Like I met a psychotherapist who said to me he found himself in a cycle of blaming his clients. Like they would say something and he would be thinking, I told you 6 months ago what to do. If you'd only done it, you wouldn't be going through this. Or we might have that strange savior mentality, like, I am going to be the one that will resolve all of this. I can control what is happening. Or we might have what is called the compassionate response. So compassion, in that sense, is defined as moving toward to see if we can be of help. So it's not moving into the suffering to burn up ourselves. It's moving toward and to see if we can be of help. So that implies some wisdom. Like, I'm not in control of the universe. I will do what I can do, and it's not ultimately up to me. It implies balance. Like maybe there's compassion for oneself as well as compassion for someone else, the sense of limits or boundaries, a kind of stability, not feeling overcome. And so that exploration, I think, is intricate and fascinating. Like, what is compassion and what do we mean? And even though we use the words empathy and compassion in colloquial language, as synonymous, they're actually not synonymous. They're more sequential.
Right. And there's in loving kindness where you tend to start from yourself and then kind of radiate out this compassion to larger and larger groups of people until it's for all kind of conscious beings. And yeah, I think that's a good maybe way to think about the difference between empathy and compassion, because if you're practicing empathy and you're letting in all of the suffering into your heart and letting it weigh on you in a way that was imbalanced, then that wouldn't be sustainable. But compassion has this inexhaustible quality that it really can just be radiated to everyone.
Yeah. No, that's a nice way of expressing it. It does tend to be inexhaustible, and that sort of over-identification of empathy does tend to be exhausting. So then who does that serve in the end?
And then the idea of loving everyone, I think is the kind of logical endpoint, and having compassion for everyone. And I think this is, you can hold both these perspectives where for the individual who suffered, anger is often necessary to assert a boundary. These emotions are valid and real. We're not saying preemptively forgive everyone who's ever hurt you. But I do think that, there's this ultimate wisdom and it is linked to, I think, getting out of that relative way of thinking and of just seeing everyone as the result of their conditioning. Everything's just kind of playing out. And when you see that way, it is freeing, I think, just to take someone who's hurt you and say, oh, I see why you did that. And it's not, it also actually allows you to have the boundary you mentioned earlier of, there could be someone who's been very toxic and has really hurt you. And you could say, I have complete compassion for you. I want the best for you, but I don't want to spend any time with you. Like, nothing good comes from definitely spending time together.
Yeah. And I'm going to maybe in certain contexts see what I can do to stop your agenda from being successful or whatever. Like, I think the most popular thing I've ever posted on the internet was compassion doesn't mean we don't fight. It means we don't hate.
Yeah.
And
I was going to quote that.
Yeah. It's like, it's the most retweeted or whatever, of anything I've ever written. And it's very hard to understand because we do think of these qualities as squishy. And I think it takes a real experience of the cost within ourselves of being bent on revenge. And I totally agree with you. I would never say to somebody who's been harmed, sometimes so horribly harmed, time to get over it. Like
Yeah.
we have to love everybody, and it's ridiculous. But the cost within of being consumed by hatred, as compared to feeling anger, but being able to extract the energy of it and not the kind of burning. The cost is pretty significant. And when I was writing Real Change, I thought, oh, you know what I want to do? I want to use that Gandhi quote where he said something like, being lost in anger. And again, I'm distinguishing being lost in anger from just feeling anger. Being lost in anger is like drinking poison thinking it's going to kill the other guy. So I looked it up because I wanted to use it in the book. And I never saw it attributed to Gandhi. I saw it attributed to the Buddha and Oprah Winfrey and the Big Book of AA and Carrie Fisher and Nelson Mandela. And I have no idea who said it. But that's sort of the point. It's not because we're trying to be righteous or squelch anger. It's out of the greatest compassion for ourselves that we might say, what other sources of strength are there that are genuinely sources of strength, and taking action that may not involve both the burning and the delusion. It's like if you think of the last time you were really, really angry at yourself and just bring it up, it's not a time where you think, you know what? I did 5 great things same morning. It's like those are gone. So what information are we losing? What options are we losing? What chance at creativity are we losing if we're just consumed by that kind of anger? And it's a delicate thing to extract the energy of it and not at all ever blame yourself for what you're feeling, but realizing being dedicated to the cultivation and the rehearsing and the going over and over and over and over my grievance, that may not be that healthy for me.
I feel like you mentioned you get a lot of this kind of pushback of people saying, "Oh, it's kind of squelchy and not powerful." And I mean, you actually use the analogy in the book of water, which is really powerful. I think, right, of how water seems to be the most yielding fluid thing imaginable, but give it enough time and it will wear through mountains. And I think that's quite a powerful analogy. But to me, it seems I can't help but see the kind of these teachings around love as the most profound thing out there and the most powerful thing out there, and any cynicism or dismissing of it as a kind of self-defensive, trying to kind of protect oneself, I guess, because I feel like suffering in the world does arise out of fear and trauma, like at a societal level of people kind of closing off from each other, closing off from compassion, and as you say, doing kind of abysmal things to each other when they lose that kind of spark of love. And so I do think, yeah, if there's one thing we could focus on that would help make maximum change in the world, it would be this topic.
I think that's true. And I think, it's in times of such enormous stress and strife like we have now that more people reach out for some tools. And, I've just been so grateful that I've been practicing for so long. And like, I had tools I could rely on, it was everything else, all expectations of where it would be, what my life looked like. And, it just went away. Like, and yet, I really felt supported by both streams of practice, mindfulness and loving kindness.
Right. And if someone wants to look into this stuff further to kind of resource themselves with tools, where can they go to find more of your work?
Well, my website is just SharonSalzberg.com, and there's all kinds of, things on there on the website. Some reference to, the books I've written and recordings that are out there, and sometimes collective efforts we do, like a 28-day challenge, and now and then, or things that in building community of like-minded people that we can all practice together.
Great. Well, thanks, Sharon. I've really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much.